President Trump announced new tariffs today that could affect U.S. trading partners all over the world. The plan is to impose reciprocal tariffs on any country that charges a tax or fee that hurts U.S. businesses. The CBC's Richard Madden joins us now from D.C. with more. So, Richard, who is going to be affected by this?
Yeah, pretty much everyone around the world in this memorandum that the president issued today. Some might call it a chirp, Catherine. President Trump calling it the big one, which could see the U.S. slapping reciprocal tariffs on America's trading partner, which really risks stoking the flames of a global trade war. Now, under the president's new memorandum, it's not an executive order. He's essentially ordered a sweeping study on all U.S. trade relationships to match the tax rates other countries charge on U.S. imports. So the White House calls this a fair and reciprocal plan to correct long-standing imbalances in international trade. And under this memo, Trump is giving U.S. trade officials 180 days. That's 6 months to study global trade and come up with a plan for reciprocal tariffs. Now, he singles out most favored nation status and says it just doesn't add up. And one of the big targets here is Canada. We'll get into that in a moment. But the big picture here is that Trump is aggressively pushing to overhaul America's trade relationship and is using tariffs as a weapon. And it's not just against America's adversaries. He's also hitting allies, including Canada, the EU, and India. Now, in his fact sheet, he says the EU slaps a 10% tariffs on cars made in the U.S., but the U.S. only charges a 2.5% tariff on things like BMWs and Mercedes and Audis. He says India charges a 100% tariff on all U.S.-made motorcycles, but the U.S. charges a 2.4% tariff on Indian motorcycles. Now, it's worth noting India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's a big fan of Trump, is visiting the White House at this hour, so we'll see if he'll be able to convince the president to ease up. But Trump has said there's no exceptions. He's a firm believer these reciprocal tariffs will not only equalize the trade playing field, but will encourage domestic production here in the U.S. But obviously, the politics of this could backfire. Building industries don't happen overnight, and tariffs are a tax likely paid by American consumers, driving up inflation, which is the exact opposite of what Trump promised. And these tariffs could add to the other tariffs Trump has threatened, right? We've got the 25% on all global steel and aluminum, plus the other 25% tariffs on allies Canada and Mexico that could take effect next month, and those ones linked to border security and fentanyl production. So you add this all up, and the threats of retaliation by Canada, we could see a major escalation on the prices for goods coming from both countries if these trade threats become more than just bluster.
Yeah, well, we were talking about chirps a minute ago, Richard. What else did the president have to say about Canada today? Yeah,
a lot of chirps on Canada's digital services tax, which, of course, came into force under the Trudeau government last year. That tax on a 3% tax on all digital service companies that have more than $20 million of revenue from Canadian sources. Basically, it's all the stuff you buy online, whether it's, virtual stores, advertising, or social media platforms. Trump took specific aim at that and says other countries should not be allowed to slap a separate tax on American companies. Trump also called out Canada again on several other irritants, including Canada's military spending in NATO. Watch.
Canada is just about the lowest payer. Also, they shouldn't be. They are just about the lowest payer in NATO, in addition to everything else. So Canada's really been taken advantage of. And if they had to pay just something modestly fair, they would be able to succeed as a country. And that's why I feel they have to become a state. Yes.
So President Trump with yet another chirp, as we've been saying, against Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, calling him Governor Trudeau. And these comments and these latest threats come, of course, as Canadian premiers wrap up a visit to Washington with mixed results, especially as this administration escalates its critiques against Canada and with more threats of those punishing tariffs on the table.
Okay. The CBC's Richard Madden. Thank you very much for this, Richard.
You bet. Thanks.
We checked in with another one of the Canadian leaders in Washington during this important week. Spoke earlier with Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew joins us from Washington. Hello. Thank you for making the time, Premier.
Thanks for having me.
Donald Trump's latest threats are these reciprocal tariffs. The fact sheet put out by the White House specifically mentions being unhappy with Canada about the digital services tax. This is coming in the midst of this flurry of other threats. How are you making sense of this latest push?
As Canadians, I think it's been very inspiring to see the country rally together around the flag and to see that sense of Canadian pride. And what you're seeing from the president today, I think, is just another sign that we're going to have to ride the wave. And what I mean by ride the wave is this past week, while we're down here as the premiers, when we talked about the efforts we've made on the border, there was a really good response. When we talked about energy, electricity from Manitoba, for example, when we talked about critical minerals, that was really well received. And so I think there's going to be these issues that continue to come up and that we're going to have to respond. We're going to have to work together with the Americans on certain issues. We're going to have to stick up for ourselves as Canadians at other moments, but we're going to have to just be calm, and hopefully there's a message of reassurance I can share with Canadians that we're always standing up for your jobs and our economy, but we're just going to have to be able to be responsive and to stay on top of things, as we know that the president is able to command such attention around the world.
Indeed. I wonder how your trip to Washington and the conversations you've been having have affected your sense of whether or not Canada can avoid tariffs.
Well, there's no tariffs today. And of course, the sun rose again in the east today, as it always does. And so it's a good day. I thought we had a very good week down here as Canada's premiers. We spoke to people in the administration, people in the Senate, people in the House, other influential Americans. Today, of course, many of us fanned out and took other meetings. I was able to connect with Doug Burgum, the Secretary of the Interior, and he's a cabinet member as part of the Trump administration. And for our team, that was a very good meeting to have. We were able to connect about energy and some of his priorities. I'm talking about electricity and, some of our jobs in Manitoba. And the fact that we have somebody in the Trump administration who knows where Manitoba is on the map.
Well, he used to be your counterpart, right? He used to be the North Dakota governor.
He was a former governor. Like,
yeah.
we overlapped for a little bit. He was a huge help. We were dealing with a situation about a year ago on the energy file, and the fact that there's that familiarity, not just with Manitoba, but also with Canada. I think it's good. We're here to relate before we negotiate. It may be that we get to a negotiation around a review of USMCA and CUSMA, but in order for us to have a good foundation to work through those potential negotiations, we got to have the relationships first. And I think that was a big part of the success of this week for the premiers, was building those relationships.
In your conversations with him, given that he is so engaged with this question of U.S. energy, I wonder what sort of sense you came away from vis-a-vis Canada using our energy supply as a bargaining chip if indeed we do get to a state of retaliation. Is that something that the Trump administration is sensitive to or at all concerned about?
Well, I'm trying to build the relationship with Secretary Burgum, and so part of that means that I am going to leave a lot of our conversation to the private nature that it was. But what I would say at a very high level is I think that is a very good relationship for us to have. That is an influential person. That's somebody who was on Air Force One on Super Bowl Sunday. That's somebody who's taken a lead on the energy file. And we saw over the past few weeks that energy and critical minerals and electricity are important, not just to Canadians, but also to Americans. And when we think about the global context that we're all operating in, there's this global race on artificial intelligence. AI is going to be this huge, huge force, probably bigger than social media was in terms of changing our society and driving our economy. And there's a huge demand for power, base load power in particular. And we have that in Canada, whether it's our hydroelectricity in Manitoba, as well as other provinces like BC and Quebec, whether it's Ontario's nuclear power, whether it's gas from the other prairie provinces. We know that Canada has base load power. And so there's these areas where our interests are aligned. And the fact that we're always going to be neighbors, no matter what happens, I think suggests that we're going to find a way to work things out through this relationship.
Some of the other premiers have said that when it comes to that meeting you folks had at the White House yesterday, one of the big takeaways from speaking to senior staffers in the Trump administration was you have to take Donald Trump at his word. Can we really do that? I mean, on the one hand, his word is so varied, right? Critical minerals, military spending, the border, you name it. He's not consistent, and he also doesn't always live up to his word. So is taking Donald Trump at his word a good strategy for Canada?
Well, what I heard is that we have to take him seriously. And when the president says that he's concerned about the border or he's concerned about fentanyl, then that's something that we should take seriously. And then we should reflect on our Canadian values. Is it consistent with our values as Canadians that we have border security? Yeah, I think it is. Is it consistent with who we are as Canadians that we get rid of fentanyl? Yeah, I think so. And so that's what I mean by we're going to need to ride the wave here. We're going to have to figure out through our Canadian lens, how do we listen to this Trump administration and then respond in a way that's consistent with who we are, that protects our jobs and our economy, but also shows that we're evolving and we're responding, because we know that the United States of America has changed. And so the relationship between our countries will continue to evolve as well.
What is one thing that you learned in that meeting at the White House that you did not understand as clearly before?
Well, I might just maybe go more to the nature of the show being a peek behind the political curtain and just say that the folks we met with had perfect message discipline. Trump administration's message. So just on the level of somebody in politics and seeing, how consistent they were with what the president has said publicly, that definitely stood out to me. But I think, this is an administration that is still being stood up. Not just talking about the White House or the folks in cabinet, but even with folks in Congress. We're talking about people who've just moved into their offices, people who don't have their business cards yet, people who don't have the imprimatur of their office on their stationery, right? And so we're here as the premiers from every single province and territory in Canada, making those connections on the ground floor in many instances. And I know there's so much uncertainty and so much attention on this from Canadians right now that everybody wants a quick fix. They want to get to the end of the story, if you will, with a happy ending at that right away. But we have to understand that this isn't just about the next 4 minutes, 4 hours, 4 days. This is about the next 4 years. And so being here as premiers, as Team Canada, alongside Labor and alongside business leaders, I think is really important, because this is something that we're going to have to nurture. Again, we're going to have to stand up for ourselves at those important moments, but we're also just going to have to continue to develop this relationship, because the political winds of change may blow, but they're never going to blow hard enough to change the geography and the fact that we are going to be neighbors to America and they're going to be neighbors to us.
And yet Donald Trump continues to insist on this 51st state comment. And we know the Prime Minister said just last week, it's a real thing. I wonder what your sense of how seized the people around Donald Trump are with that conversation is.
Well, I think they notice that it gets a reaction, and that's why they keep pushing it. We know that Canada will never be the 51st state. We are the true north. Strong and free, and we're proud about it. And you know what? In Manitoba, we shout the true north part when we go to the Winnipeg Jets hockey games. So again, there's a lot of Canadian pride going on right now. And I think one thing that we're going to have to keep in mind is maybe take a little bit of what we do on the ice, which is somebody chirps you, you got to chirp back, and you do it with a sense of humor. You do it with the willingness to stick up for yourself when the time calls for it, but you also do it knowing that you can go for beers when the game's over.
You want to throw out a chirp right now, Premier?
Yeah, no, the whole thing has been just nothing but some chirps and handshakes and relationship building here all week.
Okay. All right. Listen, Wab Kinew, Manitoba Premier, you're having an exceptionally busy few days. Really appreciate you making time for the show. Thank you.
No, thanks for having me.
Northwest Territories Premier R.J. Simpson joins me. Hello, Premier.
Good afternoon.
Officials here in Canada are trying to make sense of whether these reciprocal tariffs Donald Trump described will affect this country. It's possible, for example, that the GST would make us a target. What is your sense of what this could mean for Canada?
You know what, I think this is just the way things go now. There's an announcement, there's limited details around it, and then we scramble to figure out what's going on. So, I'm here in Washington. We're having meeting with officials from multiple countries, and so I haven't even really had a chance to look into today's newest announcement that people are scrambling to figure out.
Add a perhaps fourth source of tariffs to your to-do list. Listen, let's ask you about those announcements, though, as folks here in Canada try to make sense of all of this. You were meeting with officials from Greenland today. They are certainly feeling targeted by Donald Trump. Canada is as well. What did you learn from talking to them about what Canada can do to more effectively push back against the United States?
Well, it was an interesting conversation. It was a lot of information sharing. They're in a similar situation where there's been announcements made, vague details available, and really unclear what the next steps are or what the current thinking of the administration is. So, we discussed the process, what they have experienced so far, who they've been speaking with, and we talked about our experience. And so it was really a relationship building meeting from my perspective. And we talked about how we can work together better in the future, given that there's so much uncertainty elsewhere. It's an opportunity for us to shore up our relationships closer to home.
What were you able to glean? I mean, the threat is more visceral for them, obviously, because of the kind of language that Donald Trump is using, more of this sense of a possibility of military force. What did you come to understand about how that is affecting them, their counterparts?
Well, similar to how, on Canadians' minds, tariffs are top of mind. People are thinking about tariffs every day. And similarly, they have their own issues that they're thinking about every day. So there's a lot of uncertainty and maybe not a sense of how to approach it, but I can't speak for them, right? This is, they have a lot of internal things going on that we didn't get too down into details, but it feels like we're all in the same boat. That was my takeaway from that meeting. We're all in the same boat.
You were also speaking at a think tank today about collaborating with the United States on resource development and security. Some Canadians may bristle at that moment. How do we collaborate more with the United States when the president wants to absorb our country?
Well, I've been saying for a while now that Canada needs to focus on shoring up its own industrial base. We need to focus on investing in Canada, investing in infrastructure, investing in mineral exploration companies and mine development. That's what we need to do first, because there is so much uncertainty. And we have that ability in Canada. We have the resources, we have the know-how, and we have the capital. It's just how we use it. And so that's my number one priority. But we have a market in the U.S. We still have a strong relationship with the United States, especially when it comes to commercial enterprises and business. So for the foreseeable future, and I think always, we're going to have a strong economic relationship with the United States, and there's always going to be opportunities for companies to do business across borders. But that doesn't mean we don't need to look internally and do what we can internally and look at other partners elsewhere. But the fact is, we'll always have an economic relationship with the United States.
It makes me think of the pitch that Ontario's Doug Ford is making, the Fortress AmCan. Hey, guys, we can be better together. Do you think it is prudent for Canada to go more all in with the United States in the spirit of trying to protect ourselves from a worst-case tariff scenario?
I think that what the United States, from what I can tell, what they want to do is equal out the relationship. So they don't want to trade deficit with anyone. They don't want to trade surplus necessarily with anyone. And so from there, I think we have some common ground. We can find a path forward. We don't need to be taken advantage of, but we need to figure out how we can work together and not find ourselves in this situation again where on a whim, our economy can be severely damaged by another country.
In that spirit, let's talk about the meeting that you had at the White House yesterday. Quite a while, you're speaking with all the premiers and some senior officials in the Trump administration. What was the thing in that meeting that made you sort of sit up a little bit straighter, that really caught your attention or deepened your understanding of the situation that we're facing?
Well, the meeting we had was very high level, and they were high level advisors to the president, but there was really nothing beyond what was said publicly. And President Trump says a lot of things publicly, and so there's a lot of information out there. And what I gleaned from that meeting was that listen to what the president is saying, and that's what we have to work with. And so it's up to us to really figure out, in that context of uncertainty, how do we create our own certainty?
What do you think Donald Trump's ambition is for Canada's critical minerals then?
Critical minerals are integral to any modern economy. And so I'm sure he would like access to those critical minerals. And I don't mean that they're going to bring tanks up here and take the critical minerals. That's not how things work. There's mining companies who do business. They look for investors. There's a whole process around this, and it doesn't matter if you're in Canada or the United States. That's the way it works. The government doesn't come and take the minerals out of the ground.
Can I jump in there? Because I'm just going to jump in there, Premier, because I also heard your colleague from the Yukon making that point very clearly in this conversation that you had earlier today, a recording of it at the Wilson Centre. And the fact that you're both taking pains to say, hey, this isn't how it works. Do you feel like there is someone in the administration or the president himself who doesn't understand that? Or is that a message for a domestic audience? Like, why are you both going to such lengths to express that?
No, this is for the domestic audience. This is for, my constituents, the people of the territory, the people of Canada, so they understand that, that's currently the way things work. And, the government doesn't have the capacity, the knowledge to go in and do that kind of work. So I don't foresee the U.S. government getting into that economic sphere. But I think what we need to do is ensure that we make this an attractive place for investment, an attractive place to do business. We create a regulatory environment and a trade environment that other countries are comfortable with. And if that's the United States, that's great. If it's not, well, that's great too. We need to take care of Canada and ensure that we are benefiting from our own resources.
In closing, I want to ask you about that tweet that came out after you and your counterparts left the White House. James Blair, one of the officials you met with, tweeted to make it clear that in the conversation you had, the Americans never agreed in that meeting that Canada would not be the 51st state. What does it tell you that the Americans around Donald Trump are so insistent on that issue?
Well, I get the sense that they work for the president, and they're not going to speak on behalf of the president. And so if the president puts a message out there, that's their message. They're not going to interpret it differently for foreign dignitaries coming into the country. And so I imagine that they just wanted to ensure that it was clear that they were not giving us a message different than the president is putting out there.
Yeah, really emphasizing once again that on all of these issues, it all comes down to what's in Donald Trump's mind, I guess. Listen, Premier, you have had an incredibly busy few days. Really appreciate you making the time to talk with us about it. Thank you.
Anytime. Thank you.
That's Northwest Territories Premier R.J. Simpson.
Canada's been very bad to us on trade, but now Canada's going to have to start paying up. This is going to be a very interesting situation because, we just don't need their product.
You would be forgiven for having a little bit of deja vu, still sorting out the difference precisely between these reciprocal tariffs and the punitive tariffs that Trump has already promised. Canada's digital services tax appears to be one of Trump's targets. And all the while, Trump has also come out swinging against Canada's military spending.
Canada is just about the lowest payer also, they shouldn't be. They are just about the lowest payer in NATO in addition to everything else. So Canada's really been taken advantage of. And if they had to pay just something modestly fair, they wouldn't be able to succeed as a country. And that's why I feel they have to become a state.
After a week of high-level talks in Washington, has anything changed? Let's bring in the power panel. Nigan Sinclair is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press. Cameron Ahmad is a former head of communications to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister. And Françoise Boivin is a former NDP MP. Hello, everybody. Cameron, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to ask you to try to make sense of this. I feel like, there's a list now, right? The 25% universal tariffs, the 25% steel and aluminum tariffs, the April 1st assessment of broader tariffs, and now also these reciprocal tariffs. Like, how do we even make sense when it is a snowstorm of tariff threats coming at us?
Good question. Hard to make sense of it all, and certainly hard to predict the outcome. It might be impossible to predict how this plays out. I think what the government needs to keep doing is try and manage each announcement step by step and leverage the united front from all the premiers and from everyone across society and across the economy who has shown this united front. Politically speaking, it's obviously going to continue dominating the narrative of an upcoming election. It's clearly dominating the narrative of the leadership race and what the opposition is talking about. But ultimately, make the case. The government needs to keep making the case that a full-blown trade war is bad for the American economy. And we've seen American leaders, whether it's politicians in swing states, whether it's chambers of commerce, try and make that case domestically. And the more we can do that, the more we can probably get the message across. But of course, the impact of a trade war is going to be worse for us than it will be for the U.S. And it's going to be rough weather, and we're going to have to hang tight and keep showing that united front.
Nigana, I want to bring you in here. I'm still very interested in the questions surrounding the Premier's visit to the White House yesterday. I mean, on the one hand, the Premiers have argued the fact that somewhat high-level officials within the White House made time for them speaks well to the fact that, you know, Canada is on the radar, Canadian concerns are on the radar. The flip side of it, I've interviewed several of the Premiers now who were involved in that visit, and it seems like they didn't learn a lot new. They were told you got to take Donald Trump at his word, which I would suggest and did suggest in my interview earlier with Wab Kinew might be a bit of a complicated thing to do at best. And they're just basically saying this was message track. How valuable or important do you think that conversation was?
Well, unfortunately, a meeting with the Deputy Chief of Staff for Legislative Affairs, James Blair, probably doesn't get anything done. What it does is it sort of indicates that the Trump administration doesn't think particularly highly about anyone other than Danielle Smith. One of the real big concerns, I think, is that the premiers are the ones who are most often going to be the most in charge of some of these, will handle the biggest brunt of some of these tariffs, both internally and externally, and that they will be the ones that perhaps need to get the most amount of attention, even more so than some of the members of the Canadian federal government. And so it just indicates to you that I don't think that there's any interest from the Trump administration to deal with this issue. What they really want is they want to make several different avalanches of threats, have all of us scurrying about and moving, talking, thinking, imagining what these tariff threats might look like. And then in the end of the day, how many times are we going to allow for a boy to cry wolf over and over and over again, when it might just be a fact of perhaps we're seeing that the impacts on the American consumer of what that might look like, maybe after the first tariff, might be the ways in which we now have a better bargaining position. The problem, of course, is that when these tariffs keep avalanching down and the provinces have to then deal with it, the united front may then start to begin to crack. And that may be a real big issue, especially when Canada comes to the table and starts to talk about tariffs on energy. If that really comes to the table, if Canada proceeds in the track, then we might not always see the united front amongst the premiers. And I think that will be a big concern, that this united front, this rally around the flag, may start to show some real problems.
James, I'd like you to reflect a bit more on how the government should talk about new tariff threats. I mean, I don't know that there's any reason we should think that he's done now, right? He's threatened the auto sector. We know he's interested in critical minerals. Like it does feel like Canada is very much in his crosshairs, and he really loves tariffs. So in the Venn diagram, we're popping up a lot.
It's a challenge to find clarity from time to time, but I think on this point, we need to recognize that Donald Trump views tariffs as a virtuous thing. He's not bringing in tariffs reluctantly because we haven't done enough on fentanyl, or we haven't done enough with regard to our border, or not spending enough in the Arctic. He says tariffs are a beautiful thing. It's a source of revenue to the American government that he believes foreigners pay. It's not true. He believes it to be true, so therefore you operate on that plane. You know, so the government has to sort of have clarity about this, that we can play whack-a-mole and kind of, you know, react to the daily words of the president that are incongruent with yesterday's words. But yeah, I think you have to transact with clarity and assume that this president, who brought in 232 tariffs against steel and aluminum back in his first term as president, he's bringing them in again now. He's threatening to do it across the board on all kinds of products and to stack them one on top of the other. This is a president who views tariffs as a beautiful thing, and Canada has to act appropriately. One of the most important things the government needs to do, which I don't know that they have done yet, is speak truth and clarity to the Canadian public and say, this is going to hurt. It's going to hurt for a long time, but we're going to make sure that we make our case as best and as clearly and dispassionately and substantively as possible to the broad sweep of Americans, to let them know that America is wealthier because you're a partner with Canada. You get our fuel, you get our oil and gas, you get our hydroelectricity, you get food from us, you get cars at a discounted price because of our manufacturing efficiency. You get a lot from Canada, and America is strong because we're your partner in this North American platform. Consistently make that argument time and time again, because in the fullness of time, these tariffs on American consumers will defeat the American economy, will punish American consumers, and they will have nobody to blame but Donald Trump.
Yeah, although that does mean, like, can't go over it, have to go through it, I suppose, is the challenge. Françoise, what James was saying there, he, of course, a former cabinet minister in the Harper era, does echo what Stephen Harper was saying in a speech that was covered by the Toronto Star, where he talked about how he would be willing to impoverish Canada in order to maintain our nationhood were he still Prime Minister. And when we were talking about that yesterday on the Power Panel, the suggestion from some of the panelists was, well, Stephen Harper, it's easier for someone who is not currently in office to say something like that. That's a harder message to swallow from our leaders, whereas, James is suggesting to some extent that the Prime Minister, the leaders in this country, need to be clearer about the difficult road ahead. What do you think about where the line of communication should be on that point?
Although I do agree that it's easier to say when you're not in office, I'm not so sure that Stephen Harper would have said the same thing as Prime Minister, because it's not in the active politicians' DNA to do so. But I do think he's on the right path. And I think, in some aspect, yes. And we have to be realistic. I mean, I do believe from what I heard President Trump say today that he upgraded his threats, because he doesn't just talk about tariffs. He's also making the very insulting assumption, and I know you want to stay optimistic and positive, and I'm very positive when I say that, because actually he just lit a fire under my seat. But he claims that if we try to achieve the 2% in the GDP ratio for military, as an example, we won't be able to sustain as a country that is rich. We might not have 400 million people, but we do have 42 million strong people and tons of resource. So when he says we don't need anything from them, I'm almost tempted to say, hey, I'll take you to your word. So here you go. You won't get nothing. But to do so, and I wrote this on X just to see the reactions of people, of Canadians. Most people agree that that's what we should do. If I had added, but we guys are going to suffer a lot, which politicians usually don't like to say. I'm sure I would have lost maybe 50% of the people agreeing with me. But it is something that we need to go. And at that point in time, the president not only upgraded his thing, but I think he changed also the second question for the next election, which is, okay, who's going to be best to face me? But also, who's got the best plan to make sure that his idle threats, or whatever you call them, threats, that varies every day and every week and for how long, will make us be standing as an independent force of nature country. And it's not because we're smaller in numbers that we are not a strong country. So I think he just changed the deal today, and it might backfire in the face of the Americans.
So Cameron, I mean, your job used to be to talk to the Prime Minister in part about what he was going to communicate. Françoise used that word suffer. I mean, to say Canadians, you might have to suffer is one thing. To say Canadians, you might have to lose your job, or in order to continue to be associated with your job, it might be the result of some sort of like government subsidy. Would you make the case to the Prime Minister right now that that is something he should be saying to the Canadian people?
I think James laid it out really well. I think this is such a unique moment. I mean, it's not entirely unique because we dealt with the first Trump White House, but clearly we're in a more severe and serious situation right now. And I think you saw the Prime Minister and the government, and frankly, lots of governments around the world do this during COVID, where they tried to level up with people and be honest about the stakes and be honest about the potential impacts on their lives, on their jobs. And in that situation, because it was so fluid, it was happening every day. I mean, people's lives were changing dramatically, instantly. This case, the potential impacts on our economy, on people's livelihoods, on their jobs, on our businesses, I mean, so widespread. I think it is valuable to be very frank with people about what could happen and to try and deliver a message that is a little more long-term while simultaneously dealing with every single threat that is leveled and trying to do the work behind the scenes, but also communicate how that work is actually resulting in the outcome you want. So, yeah, I do agree. I think that it would be valuable, and even forget about the election, forget about short-term politics. This is something that matters much more deeply to our future as a country and to the fabric of our society. So, yes, I hope I would be, to answer your question.
Well, Nigana, I want to sort of turn this on its head and talk about what the government is not communicating nearly as much about. Certainly something we think about as journalists too, which is all the things that are getting pushed off of the agenda. Ukraine, Gaza, and I'm not meaning to suggest that the federal government has said nothing on these topics, but something I'm interested in as well is the extent to which Canada is constrained in being as frank as it might consider being, or the Canadian government, I suppose I should say, because you don't want to further provoke somebody who is holding a lot of Canada's economic well-being in his hands. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, a big question to ask yourself, just on a simple basis, is what does it look like for Canadian foreign aid when we've got a U.S. president who is working very closely with the Kremlin to try to annex, and I'll use that word annex, remove most of Ukraine's lands and then give Russia carte blanche when 25% of our foreign aid goes to the Ukraine. Like, what does that really look like? And the world is shifting very much, and whether we're aware of it or not, and we're focusing particularly on tariffs, most of our messaging over the past few weeks, particularly from the media's point of view, as we followed the government, and I'll go back to the example of the premiers for a moment. If we're going to send the entire slate of Canadian premiers down to Washington and have really nobody of note meet them, then why are we continuing to do this? Why are we acting reactively to the U.S. government, which of course wields a tremendous amount of power? But if they want to continue to make threats after threats, make up different threats every single other day and have us scurry around and continue, at what point will we declare that the boy who cries wolf is crying wolf? And of course, these are very real threats. Of course, there's going to be very big impacts if the tariffs come in. But I think that what we may want to look at is a more proactive approach of talking about the things that we are interested as Canadians, focusing on some very serious issues that are happening within the country itself. I mean, we still haven't, the words climate change haven't come out of the mouth of almost anybody for weeks now. And on top of that, all of the different areas around social justice, or the report that we just had from JP just a few minutes ago around the U.S. border and the arms and drugs that are coming from the U.S. side into Canada. That's a much more pivotal and important conversation, I think, right now than tariffs and how we're going to deal with that. If we are more proactive, then what we will do is we'll begin to shift the dialogue off of being a reactive U.S. president that seems to be looking more for trying to get a negotiating position with not just us, but throughout countries across the world. And as the tariffs come, I think that will play itself out from the U.S. side. And as James pointed out, I think that the U.S. economy will show Trump what to do and will punish Trump accordingly. It will be hard, but focusing on the internal affairs within the country and preparing for what that looks like, shoring up, as some of the leadership candidates from the Liberal leadership campaign are talking about, that will probably be a much more effective approach in building the country versus acting so reactively.
Okay, we've only got a little bit of time left for this topic, but I do want to hear from both James and Francois. So James, a quick thought from you.
You're looking for optimism. Here's optimism. In almost all of Canada's provinces, the premiers have fresh mandates. British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario's about to go. Quebec and Alberta still have time on the clock. Unicameral legislatures, all with majority parliaments. They can all do whatever they want in the provinces, and they seem to be united in building a strong Canada. We're about to have an election campaign in this country. Good. Let's have a clear choice between two alternatives to govern the country with a clear 10-year plan for building the economy. Let's accept reality on reality's terms, accept the fact that Donald Trump is what he is, and let's have a real pan-Canadian national debate about how we're going to build for the next 10 years. And whoever wins the next election, turn to those premiers who have fresh mandates and majority mandates in provincial legislatures and say, let's get on with it and build a strong country that's tied together from east to west and move forward, build more global markets, break down internal barriers to trade, be more efficient with our economy, and let's build Canada. Let's use this threat and this risk to our livelihood as a weapon to galvanize the Canadian instinct to be stronger and better than we've been so far. There's the optimism, and I think that's what this campaign should be about, and I hope it is.
Françoise, quick thought from you.
I cannot top that optimism, and James, you are bang on. The only thing I would add is maybe while we're doing this and taking less interest into everyday télé-réalité Donald Trump in Oval Office, maybe we'll forget about us. Maybe even journalists will forget to ask questions about what about Canada, and maybe he won't even think about us. He'll have so many other things to deal with. So I totally agree, James, that's what, let's turn this moment for a Canadian moment and act accordingly.
Well, despite the Premier's efforts yesterday at the White House, the U.S. president is still threatening tariffs and still talking about Canada becoming a state.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens. But it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection. They don't have any military protection.
So what does a former Premier think this week's trip to Washington accomplished? Rachel Notley is a member of the Prime Minister's Council on Canada-U.S. Relations and is, of course, the former Premier of Alberta as well. Rachel Notley, welcome back to the program.
Good to be here.
The premiers, as you know, met with a number of lawmakers and specifically two senior officials in the White House in Washington. We've talked to some of the premiers who were in that meeting, and the thing we keep hearing is that they were on message track. They said that Donald Trump should be taken at his word. They're not articulating a lot of new understanding that came out of this White House meeting in particular. Do you think it was a worthwhile meeting?
I think that to the extent that those two officials, who are not, of course, the most senior, but are in the White House nonetheless, get any time in the room with Donald Trump, then I think the unity and the focus and the message that was delivered by the premiers was valuable. But one doesn't know exactly how much those folks play a role. But I think that all of these conversations are important. I think the specter of all of the premiers being there together, delivering the same message, is a very important one. And it helps to undo some of the damage that might have been done a few weeks ago where there was less unity between the premiers. And it's part of a larger project of just talking to everyone south of the border, where we can get their attention to outline how damaging the current track is going to be to both people on both sides of the border.
To that point, you have said that nothing Canada can do would put more pressure on the Americans than Trump is by bringing in these tariffs. Should we understand, especially as the number of places that tariffs might come from, be it steel and aluminum, a blanket tariff, the April 1st assessment, the reciprocal tariffs, should we understand that some level of tariffs is almost inevitable for Canada at this point?
I think it's probably the case that we are going to see some level of tariff no matter what. I'm just speculating. I am really drawing on information that everybody else here is drawing on. The other thing that's happening right now, though, is that there is a profound level of uncertainty that's been imposed, regardless of what tariffs come into play, how much they are, and what they apply to. And I think that uncertainty isn't going to go anywhere soon. And so for that reason, I think that we have to react strategically, both in a short-term way, but also in a medium to long-term way, in terms of, finding ways to shift our economic activity in a way that makes us more resilient and less vulnerable to the kind of uncertainty that is coming from the White House south of the border these days.
You lived through this, of course, the first time around with the Trump administration. How do you contrast that experience with what is happening right now?
Well, it's a little hard for me to do because, of course, I'm not at the Premier's table. So the direct comparison is a bit tough. But I think certainly Canada's reaction then, I mean, we did a lot of the same stuff. We did a lot of this north-south stuff. Premiers all across the country were meeting with trade partners south of the border, subnational leadership, but also significant business partners south of the border. And that strategy ultimately worked to bring about sober second thought. And so basically they're doing the same thing again. Whether it will have the same result as quickly is harder to say. And it's obviously clear that Donald Trump has come to office deciding that he wants to redo that particular issue again. But I think that we have to keep doing it because at the end of the day, we know that there are many, many, many influential stakeholders south of the border who stand to lose a lot and stand to hear from the millions of Americans who stand to lose a lot. And so we just need to make sure that this is front and center constantly.
I want to ask you about the comments of another Albertan of a different political stripe, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who made headlines in the Toronto Star this week when he said Canada should, quote, accept any level of damage to fight for Canada's independence against Trump. What do you make of that approach and that message?
Well, I think it's another way of saying really what I've been saying, which is that, and what many of us have been saying, which is that, the uncertainty that is being created by the volatility and the unpredictability coming out of the White House is having a significant impact on Canada's economy. And quite frankly, as long as the White House looks the way it does, that's not going to change. So we have to accept that there's going to be pain no matter what. And so we might as well incur a bit of that pain on the path to making us economically stronger, more resilient, and ultimately more sovereign. And so I think really, Stephen Harper is saying a lot of what many, many people are saying. A series of dominoes have been set off, and so we need to respond, as I said, not just in the immediate sense, but we need to respond in a way that has us in a better position years and decades down the road.
I find it really striking being involved in the coverage of this. The public response is unlike really much of what I've experienced in my career as a journalist. And one thing I see from people is there is a very real, there's a fear. Some people are angry about the negative tenor of the conversation. And I wonder if just in closing I can ask you like one thought you would leave Canadians with, particularly given what you just said about the difficulty that we're going to have to potentially go through.
Well, I mean, what I would say is that I have a high level of faith that the vast majority of Canadians feel the level of loyalty and the level of appreciation for our nation that I feel. And that this is an opportunity for us to come together and remember that we are incredibly privileged to be citizens of Canada. And while sometimes it just is a thing that we take for granted, at other times we need to pull together and make sure that the privilege we're enjoying is there for generations to come. And so there can be wins out of this, and part of that is reaffirming our commitment to the things that make us proud Canadians. And so that's what I want to focus on. It doesn't have to be negative; it can be positive too. And in the long run, we'll probably be in a much better situation.
Okay, former Alberta Premier Rachel Notley, thank you very much.
Thank you.